The mansuetude and magnificence of the maternal city sprawling on the warless lagoon mellowed him like the warm balm of a moral hothouse. His malevolence melted away as he basked in a glory and affluence that accrued every day. For now his fortune turned. His official recognition in Venice and his reconciliation with Rome consecrated his reputation and sanctioned his influence, and they began to assume in the dying Renaissance a prodigious development. 2 years before, he had leased the Palazzo Bolani in the Grand Canal. It was there that he starved, and in those days it was all he could do to live up to its front. A crowd at his door meant a special occasion, a gift of wine from Mantua, for instance. Such an occasion he recalled when, in weeding out his past correspondence with the Marquis, he came on a letter which he preserved, if only to compare the past and the present. Even then he was pleased to observe his old self had laughed at himself. If I were known as a saint instead of a devil, or if I were the friend instead of the enemy of the Pope, people would conclude, seeing such a crowd at my door, either that I was working a miracle or that it was the Jubilee. And for this I have to thank your wine. No inn is as busy as my house. My servants fill the flasks of the servants of all the ambassadors in Venice from morning till night. Wherever the world eats or sits or walks, all it talks of is my perfect wine, so that I am more known for my wine than for myself, and I should have been ruined had I not received this solemn vintage. And the little moisture it brings to the eye in drinking it makes me weep in writing of it. His eyes moistened as he reread himself, and with a pleasure more acute than any wine could cause. For now such scenes were an everyday occurrence. The Jubilee was perpetual, the miracle a commonplace, and the affluence of visitors was such that his stares were worn away, as he wrote to a friend, like the pavement of the Capitol by the wheels of the triumphal chariots. I do not believe Rome, in a manner of speaking, ever saw such a mixture of nations as come to my house. I received Turks, Jews, Indians, Frenchmen, Germans, Spaniards. As for our Italians, I leave you to imagine. Of the common people I say nothing. It would be easier to wean you from the emperor than to find me for one moment without soldiers, scholars, friars, and priests around me. I seem to have become the oracle of truth. For everyone comes to tell me the wrong done to him by this prince or that priest. I've become the secretary of the world, and I sign myself such in my letters. How had this miraculous transformation come about? He had broached the solemn and inexhaustible vintage of human fatuity. Patrons multiplied about him, and they were satisfied with less than an epic, with a sonnet, a letter, a compliment, of anything that slaked the insatiable thirst of the age for praise and publicity. He no longer needed Federico Gonzaga. The world was full of his kind. And they came paddling into his canal and crowding through his door. He still corresponded occasionally with the Marquis. He sent him his compliments under glass, Venetian glass, blown especially for him. But this new design has so pleased the master glass blowers of the Sirena that they name all the various things I have made there Artini. The majordomo of the Pope has taken some to Rome, and His Holiness, I hear, went into raptures over them, and that amazes me, for I thought that in court they cared only for gold and not glass, as I know your Excellency also believes. I am your servant. He sent him snatches of Marfisa. Ah, your Excellency asks for some trifle to fan yourself in the great heat of these days. I'd send you the stanzas composed in honor of the Gonzaga genealogy. They are what they are, and I have no weakness for my brain children. And as for my opinion of the book as a whole, I refer you to my secretary, the fire. The fire was metaphorical, but his opinion was a fact. Another quarrel with the Marquis, after another quarrel with the Marquis, their relations ended. He made some minor alterations in the epic and disposed of it at second hand to a patron whose name alone entitled him to it. The Marchese del Vasto. Artino knew where his real genius lay. He was composing his reputation. And that was vaster, more fabulous, and more poetic than any poem. He was persuading the world to accept him at his own valuation, and that ambition, common to every man but realized by few, fulfilled a universal dream and was itself a poetic achievement for which the world envied and honored him. He was a poet of human conceit, and he realized a universal desire by flattering it. His own reputation rested on the common craving for fame. He capitalized and exploited it. He created and controlled public opinion. He dispensed censure and honor and made and unmade reputations. His clients in turn accepted and spread and created his own credit. He was the lawgiver of the vainglory of life. What poem was as poetic as that mere fact? Nor was that all. Though his reputation rested on nothing more solid than puff, he lived on it. His palace was crowded like the shrine of a miracle monger, with admirers bringing tribute. He was emancipated from ordinary necessities. He was converting Venice into an earthly paradise. In the celestial city, he lived on the love of his neighbor, giving and receiving instead of the hard barter and sinful sweat of the common lot, the voluntary exchange of free gifts and noble commerce of mutual admiration. He was eliminating from life the root of all evil, competition. He filled the heart of humanity with a new hope, the old hope the race left behind it in Eden, the lost hope of living on nothing. The feat was extraordinary, and he was unique, but he had proved that it could be done, and for that service alone he was pensioned as a pioneer, supported as a prophet, and applauded as a poet. He became the rage. Fashions are ephemeral, but in the ephemeral he found immortality, and his vogue spread. He ran throughout Italy, throughout Europe, and even beyond. The Bashaw of Algiers and the corsairs of the Barbary coast sent him tribute. It spanned the 4 points of the compass without breaking. It lasted with the tenacity of a legend which time could not stale, and of a superstition which it could not explode. That a fame founded on puff, maintained by fugitive correspondence, and warranted neither by talent, service, nor accomplishment, should eventually have palled on its public, may well have appeared an inexplicable mystery with the passage of time. That a fame founded on puff, maintained by fugitive correspondent, and warranted neither by talent, service, nor accomplishment, should not eventually have palled on its public, may well have appeared an inexplicable mystery with the passage of time. But time held the secret which explained his fascination, his living presence, his magnetic personality. He was supremely simpatico. He had the exuberant spontaneity, the quick responsiveness, the facile and expansive charm of his popular origin, heightened by a brilliant gloss of worldly manner which went with his wardrobe. Success, far from spoiling him, mellowed and brought out his innate geniality. His malice was skin deep, and he reserved it for professional purposes. He bit the hand that did not feed him, but he left no scar that could not be licked and healed. His temper, his petulance, his impatience, his pugnacity were as effervescent as a child's, and passed with the occasion that provoked them. And now, with the world at his feet, his jovial spirit shone forth, unclouded. He was natural. He put everyone at his ease, and it was impossible to doubt in the company of that irresistibly human creature that nature was not sound when it was satisfied. Above all, his zest for life was infectious. He communicated it to an ever-growing public which craved it and which besieged the bubbling spring, clamoring for more and more. His charm could only be felt fully at first hand, yet such was its vigor and exuberance that it overflowed into his letters, which remained still warm after the passage of time, with the tingling sparkle of personal intimacy. And it was his intimacy which made him immortal. He was one of the first to discover the appeal of the personal, the dignity of the familiar and trivial, the significance of the everlasting detail of life. He opened the eyes of his readers to the little, unconsidered, obvious things which they saw without seeing, and which he revealed by his relish in reporting and reliving them. Conducting his life in a blaze of publicity, he made copy of it. He took the world into his confidence, assuming that whatever interested him must interest it. And rightly, for nothing human was alien to him. And this was the real service he rendered to his generation. Under the bluff and hollow vainglories, the prophet proclaimed that life was enough. And certainly in Venice, in those palmy days of the 16th century, life was enough. It only needed eyes to see it, and he had the vision. From his window he commanded a view of the Grand Canal and its multifarious life on which he gloated, and his one regret was that with all his visitors he still had numberless and unknown neighbors who would never see what he saw. One day that thought was too much for him, and he snatched his pen and wrote an open letter to his landlord, who probably did not appreciate it either, for the poor man was born in Venice. "I should think it a sin of ingratitude, gentle sir," he preluded, "if I did not repay with praise a part of my debt to the divine site on which your house is built, and where I dwell with the utmost pleasure in life. For it is set in a place which neither hither nor thither, nor higher nor lower, could be better. Certainly, whoever built it gave it the most proper and preeminent place on the whole Grand Canal. And as this is the patriarch of all avenues, and Venice the pope of all cities, I may truthfully say that I enjoy the most beautiful street and the most delightful view in the world. I never go to the window, but I see thousands of people and as many gondolas going to market. The piazza to my right are the Beccaria and the Pescaria. On the left, the bridge and the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, while facing them both rises the Rialto, crowded with traders. Here I see boats full of grapes, game, and birds in the shops, and kitchen gardens on the pavements. Rivers and irrigated fields I no longer care to see now that I can watch the water at dawn covered with every manner of thing that is in season. It is a joy to study the bearers of this grand plenty of fruits and greens, and to watch them dispensing them to the porters who carry them to their stalls. But all this is nothing to the sight of 20 or 25 sailboats, heaped up with melons like a little island, and the multitude thronging about them to reckon, weigh, and smell their beauty. Of the beautiful housewives shining in silks and gold and jewels, and seated proudly under the poop, I will say nothing, lest I slight their pomp. But I will say that I hold my sides when I listen to the boatmen shouting, jeering, and roaring at those who are rowed by lackeys without scarlet hose. And what man could hold his water if he saw, as Giulio Camillo and I saw, a boatload of Germans upset in the dead of winter just as they came out of a tavern? Giulio is a wag, and he says that the side door of this house, being dark, narrow, and brutal to climb, is like the terrible name I have made for myself by venting the truth. But he adds, anyone who knows me finds in my pure, frank, and natural friendship the same calm contentment that he feels when he comes out on the portico of my palace and leans on my balcony. Moreover, to add to the delight of my eye, here are the orange groves that gild the base of the Palazzo dei Camerlinghi on the one side, and on the other the Rio and bridge of San Giovanni Grisostomo. And the winter sun cannot rise without saluting my bed, my study, my kitchen, my chambers, and my hall. In sum, if I could satisfy touch and the other senses as I satisfy sight, the house would be a heaven. For I enjoy every recreation here that can please the eye. Nor must I forget the great gentlemen, both foreign and native, who pass my door, nor my heavenly rapture when the Bucentaur goes by, nor the regattas, nor the festivals which convert the canal into a continual triumph for my eye, which is lord of all it surveys. And what shall I say of the lights which appear in the evening like scattered stars, or of the night music which tickles my ear with sweet harmonies? It would be easier to describe your profound judgment in letters and public affairs than to exhaust the delights that I enjoy merely in gazing. Therefore, if there be any faint breath of talent in the trifles I have written, I owe it to the influence neither of shadow, nor of light, nor yet of verdure, nor of violence, but to the joy I feel in the airy felicity of your mention, in which may God grant me to number in vigor and health the years a respectable man may hope to live. The lust of the eye was the first revelation of his gospel. He saw and he made others see by the graphic gift of a pen which translated the vision instantaneously. And the vision in Venice was so entrancing that the puzzle of life seemed to be solved merely by sitting at a window and watching it drift by. Life was a puzzle to those who lived it, and a pattern to those who watched it, and all its miseries were no more, maybe, than the aberrations of misguided ambitions and the delusions of sealed senses. It needed so little to enjoy it, and gaudeamus was the secret of goodness. Life was simple and good when it was lived sanely and sensually, but it was perpetually distorted wantonly and perversely by the pernicious illusions of human conceit, glory, ambition, honor, achievement, visionary ideals, which faded like vapors amid the visual virtues of Venice. There the insinuating and hourly circulation of water passed like a pervasive current of oblivion amid the life and handiwork of man, isolating and intensifying their substantial realities. Sometimes that lingering basement of oblivion troubled Artino. There were hours when sickness or solitude undermined his vitality, but he had only to open his window to recover his unclouded Venetian view of life. "My dear gossip," he wrote on one such evening to Titian, "having in contempt of my custom supped alone, or rather in company of this tedious fever, which lets me relish no food, I rose from table, surfeited with the despondency with which I sat down to it, and resting both arms flat on the windowsill, and leaning my whole body on it, I abandoned myself to the marvelous spectacle of the multitude of boats. And when the crowds had dispersed, I, like a man weary of himself and with nothing to occupy his mind, raised my eyes to the heavens, which, since God made them, were never so lovely with light and shadow. The atmosphere was such as men like myself, who envy you because they cannot be you, would render it. First, the buildings in the foreground, although of stone, seemed to be of some plastic material, and beyond them you beheld the air, in some parts pure and alive, and other murky and shallow. Fancy, too, how I marveled at the clouds, dense with moisture, lying half in the foreground over the roofs and half in the gloaming, for on the right everything was a sfumato, darkening down into grey-black. I was spellbound by the variety of hues they revealed. The nearest burned with the embers of the sunset, the farthest glowed with a dimmer leaden hue. Ah, how beautifully the hand of nature hatched the air, making it fade and recede from the palaces, as Titian does in his landscapes. Here was a blue-green, and there a green-blue, truly conceived by the caprice of nature, that master of masters. She melted and modeled with light and shadow in a manner which made me exclaim more than once, "Oh, Titian, where are you? Upon my word, if you had painted what I report, you would confound men with the wonder that astounded me. And in gazing on what I have told you, I nourished my soul with it, for the wonder of such paintings does not endure." The other senses nourished his soul as benignly, and he glorified them as eloquently. He composed a whole series of epistles to the Venetians in praise of the table, spending hours of delicious gustation and the recollection and anticipation of food, rhyming it with the rational good, and relishing it not only with the palate, but with the hand, the eye, the nose, and even the ear. Manifest like a phosphorescence of decay in its lust for fame. Fame, no matter how venal. Fame at any price. Fame, however fictitious. An hour's fame before the night. And the scourge of princes was there to peddle it. He was fulfilling his function, and it was with the intimate satisfaction of a leech that he catered to his patron. He at least was true to himself, as he labored like a Homeric humbug, only half hearing under his tapping foot the steady lapping of the iridescent gutters of Venice, and only when the muse slumbered did he smell them. Then suddenly, there was a hiatus. His pension stopped. And for 8 months, the Marquis neither wrote nor replied to his letters. There was no explanation. His patron was completely irresponsible, and Artino was outraged. Just as he had won a foothold in Venice and was beginning to establish himself, the ground gave under his feet. Not only his mission, but his existence was endangered, and feeling himself slip toward the gutter, he felt as fictitious as Federico Gonzaga. He protested, he complained, he wrote, he fumed, he sulked, and in vain. He threw up the epic, he resumed it, he dropped it resoundingly, but to no purpose. He threatened to emigrate. And when he was ignored, he strode to the French ambassador and opened negotiations for a pension in France. Then his heart failed him. Whenever he passed through the port with its crowded shipping, his feet dragged. The plying ferries, the swarming gondolas, the argosies rocking on the lagoon, the pinnaces fleeting in the estuary, made him homesick. He muttered and made motions, but he knew that he would never embark. He preferred to perish in paradise, even if he had chosen a fool's paradise. Life was enough in Venice, and elsewhere it was too much. He called a gondola and lounged on the buoyant heave of the watery floor and cursed his luck and counted the months he had wasted in the service of Federico Gonzaga. And suddenly he remembered that it was time for his almanac. He compiled it overnight. And in the Judizio of Pietro Artino for the year 1529, there was no mention of the existence of a Marquis of Mantua. He sent it at once to the Mantuan ambassador with his permission to copy it and send it wherever he pleased. And he enclosed the Gonzaga genealogy. For my part, I consider any obligation and service I had with the Marquis broken, and in proof of this I am returning the genealogy of His Excellency, he informed him. Tell him that I have changed my mind and do not care to complete my poem in honor of a man who lets me starve, and that Pietro Artino will never lack patrons. And having written that letter, he was overcome by its finality and felt as wretched as if he had left Venice. Several weeks later, the Mantuan ambassador visited his French colleague and found that the terrible gossip had preceded him. An incident ensued to which he felt it his duty to devote a detailed report. Quote, learning from various sources of the gossip and bluster of Pietro Artino, and how he threatened to talk of all the princes of Italy when he went to France, and how he meant to avenge himself with his accustomed arms on his excellency, who would afford him plenty of matter, and how he had already begun to nag his servants, saying much less than they deserved, he wrote, I found the said Pietro in the house of the French ambassador with Count Guido and the ambassador of Florence. These gentlemen began to laugh and joke about what he had told them before my arrival. Besides the matters concerning Mantua, The Florentine envoy told me that the rascal had had the effrontery to boast that he was the cause of the dispute over the question of precedence between Mantua and Urbino, and that he had the power to injure me, which I knew to be a lie, since he had lost the goodwill of the Duke of Urbino ever since he wrote the sonnet beginning, "The Duke needs a wall for a corslet." I called the said Pietro into the presence of Count Guido and the Florentine and said that I wished him to hear what I had to say to him. I told him that as long as he had spoken honorably of my master, I had honored and loved him, but now that I had heard that he had decided to change his tone, he would forfeit my friendship, and as I had always befriended him with our illustrious lord, so I would do the contrary now, and he would regret having offended a Marquis of Mantua. Hitherto, I added, I had persuaded myself that he had spoken of his excellency under stress and because he loved him too well, but seeing him persevere in these provocations and abuse his friends and servants, I was forced to conclude that he meant what he said. To which he replied that he told the truth about his servants and friends, and that he would say whatever he pleased of his excellency, since he had nothing to do with him now and was no longer recognized as his servant, and that no man could injure him, and that he was not afraid of his excellency, and that by God he would continue to talk as he pleased. Then I told him that my master was in a position to injure him and anyone who dared to offend his honor, and that he did not show him the respect that was his due, and that if he did what he threatened, he might fare worse than he foresaw and would not be safe even in paradise. And I turned my back on him in great anger, for we had been quarreling for some time, and I moved away and began to talk to the French ambassador of other matters. But the said Pietro looked very dejected and alarmed by what I had said, and when I left the room, he followed me and begged me not to write to my master what he had said. It all came of his love and jealousy, and he never meant to write or speak of him otherwise than with honor, as a prince who deserved it, and from whom he had received many benefits, not so many as he deserved, for he deserved too many for the poem he had made in his honor. I thanked him and exhorted him to persevere in his good sentiments. The Marquis took an extremely serious view of the incident and threatened to suppress the said Pietro. This produced a startled gurgle by return post. I am Pietro Artino, it said, your servant by nature, not by art, your bosom friend in burning affection and not in frigid bondage. And I remind you that if a tongue could wear out, mine would be threadbare by now with praising you, and that if your angelic goodness hates and despises me, it hates and despises your glorious self. No king, no pope, no emperor, but the Marquis of Mantua incarnate to my soul confounds me, not for fear of my life, but for love of his great merits. And I kiss your hand, if I am still worthy to do so. Your letter, the Marquis replied 2 weeks later, and the stanzas of your Marfisa, in which you praised my house, have given me the greatest pleasure, and I have read them with the utmost delight. I cannot deny that to hear myself and my family extolled by such choice and cultivated talents as yours gratifies me, as I know that you have few equals and no superiors in the art of writing. The ground was solid once more under his feet. But Artino had suffered too much by the shock not to make his patron pay for it. He made him pay, in the first place, with a gown of black velvet, lined with gold cloth and trimmed with gold braid, a shirt and a doublet of brocade to celebrate their reconciliation. Next, he ordered, in return for these cast-off clothes, a damascened dagger of the most costly and exquisite workmanship, which would require 6 months to make, as a gift for the Marquis. And perhaps, he warned him, you will regard this as the most precious of all your precious possessions, if I am not completely bereft of judgment. The reckless generosity which he displayed when he had the means to indulge it, was even more reckless when he lacked them, and he did not count the cost when it was a case of excelling His Excellency and making him pay for it. Once more the stanzas of Marfisa began to flow. Once more he begged for an amanuensis as he was buried in a litter of rhymes of which he could make neither head nor tail, but the poem bored him. He had passed through too bitter an experience. He was wasting his talents on Federico Gonzaga. Why should he not aim higher and enlarge the scope of his poem to embrace the Pope and the Emperor? Why should he not make it a monument to his own fame and a vehicle for recovering the favor of Rome? When the Marquis became impatient with his slow progress, he retorted by putting his patron to work. "Since I have worn myself out with such fervor, making a book that will leave an everlasting memory of you and your family," he wrote him, "Your Excellency must take the trouble to press the Pope for a brief and the Emperor for a privilegio, prohibiting the unlicensed printing of this book within their domains for the next 10 years. These favors, Signore, are granted to anyone who asks for them and cannot be lightly refused to me, particularly as both His Beatitude and His Majesty are gloriously recalled in the poem." It was true, no doubt, that he had given the Pope some cause for complaint in the past, but though I have nipped him in idle chatter in these compositions which I will live, in these compositions which will live, I exalt him fervently. And since I hope to be rewarded not by princes, but by the press, I beg you not to deprive me of this profit, which is a small favor, but of much importance to me. If you do not condescend to do me the service, or if Caesar or Peter are unwilling to grant it, I shall write 20 stanzas and lampoon them so properly that anyone who prints them will be excommunicated and ruined, so that your Excellency will be doing a most pious deed in preventing such a scandal. I kiss your hands, and if I do not obtain what I ask, I shall say that my dagger, like all arms that are given, breeds enmity. The dagger brought an immediate response. The Marquis knew the meaning of noblesse oblige, and as the eagerness with which the poet pressed for a copyright seemed to promise the speedy completion of the epic, he lent himself to the scheme and directed his ambassador at Bologna to broach the question to both sovereigns. The moment was auspicious. The Pope and the Emperor had met in Bologna to settle the peace of Italy, and the Marquis was anxious that the general amnesty should include Artino. A naturally amiable man, he hoped that a reconciliation might reform the malice of that bitter time. His ambassador reported, however, that it is impossible to obtain anything for Artino, either from the Pope or the Emperor, because both say that besides his past offenses, he has recently written a testament which is most insulting to both of them. When this reply reached the poet, he picked up the epic and carried it to the pawn shop. Then, with his head still whirling, he dashed off a letter in which he vented his mortified feelings on the Marquis, and in exasperated confusion, his humiliation, his pride, his injury, his rankling grievances, and pent-up gall burst forth pell-mell with the headlong effusion of a punctured bladder. Over and above all, he rued one thing. "I never regretted anything so much as that I asked you this favor, and your ambassador will testify that he had already sent off my request when I recalled it." As for the testament, he had not written it, he knew who had. And if it was not written by one who eats his holiness's bread, I have crucified Christ. The copyright was nothing. I may lose a few scudi by the refusal, but my glory is not subject to briefs, and I can dispense with them. What mortified him was to be misunderstood. I want no briefs or privileges from anyone. They shall soon see who Artino is. Genius is not subject to the pleasure or displeasure of princes. The Pope thinks that I deserve no favors. Well, the world thinks I do. He knows very well that when I was with him, he loved me, for I'm a rare man and an honest one, and one day I trust he will open his eyes to my glory. Whatever happens, I'm his servant. Continue to use whatever means you think proper, Your Excellency, to defend the innocence of your servant. If you find that I have written the testament, cut me in 1,000 pieces. I know who's written it, but I shall keep our mouth shut, lest I be suspected of spite. But if he shut his mouth on one subject, he opened it wide on another. Signore mio, you are not only courteous, you are lavish with everyone. How can you be so close with me who adore you? When will you give me bread? When I'm dead? Is it nothing to you that a poem composed to glorify you and all who have borne or will bear your name should have to be pawned for 200 scudi to buy the bread I have eaten in writing it? I tell you what all Venice knows, and I thought when I sent you the dagger that you would give me enough to save me from shame. But my luck with you is even worse than with the Pope. I beseech you, send me in my dire need 50 scudi. It'll save my life. Then he thought of the poem in pawn. Then the thought of the poem in pawn revived his fury. By the body of St. Francis, if I had the book in my hands now, as I have not, I would burn it. If Your Excellency does not send me the money. But I know I shall have them, and I shall need them to pay a part of the debt on the dagger, which is worth more, by God, than you appreciate. And I doubt whether you would have suffered what I have suffered on account of it. 1 month from now, I shall send you a saddle. The most stupendous thing that ever a king or an emperor laid eyes on, and of more value in its kind than the dagger. And not even for this do I expect to receive so much as a shirt. May I lie in my gullet, licked, sealed, spitted, and slapped. The letter was already on its way when, with a final expectoration, he scribbled a postscript to the Mantuan ambassador. Tell His Excellency that those who have seen my dagger and his gifts and compare them are no little amazed. Tell him the truth, that I have been much blamed, and that is no jest. It was too late to murder him. The Marquis was at a loss. It was ridiculous to resent him. The colossal impudence, the outspoken calculation, the wheedling importunacy, the preposterous swagger and petulance of the man had the enormous and transparent candor of a child or a buffoon or an elementary natural force. Who could not snub an aboriginal savage? He blunted rebuke. He was a moral primitive whose cynical integrity made dignity, pride, delicacy, decency meaningless and irrelevant. He was too disarming to murder, too irrepressible to reform, and too impervious to tame. There was only one alternative: to ignore him. But after ignoring him unsuccessfully for 8 months, nothing remained for the Marquis but to humor him. Artino now realized, however, that he could not rely on the Marquis to reconcile him with Rome. About this time, Ghiberti passed through Venice. The poet sought him out, threw himself at his feet, and obtained his forgiveness for the past. Naturally, he was not satisfied with so little, and he immediately wrote to the Marquis announcing the reconciliation and begging him to write a letter of congratulation to Ghiberti and to intimate how much he would appreciate some tangible recognition from Rome of the merits of his poet. The tact which Artino displayed on this occasion did not surprise the Marquis. He had ceased to be surprised by anything which Artino might do. The acquisitive sense of that aboriginal was capable of anything, even of acquiring delicacy. And as Federico Gonzaga prided himself on his own tact, he was pleased to exercise it in behalf of his protege, if only to show him how such things were done among civilized people. He did as he was bid, and wrote Ghiberti a choicely worded letter, which he sent by special courier to Verona. Ghiberti replied with sly malice, and without haste. I am extremely gratified by the pleasure Your Excellency professes to take in my reconciliation with Monsieur Pietro, and by your condescending to consider it so important as to send me a courier expressly for that purpose. Being as I am your devoted servant, any little service of this sort will be agreeable to me, particularly one which you consider so great that henceforth I shall consider it such myself. When the Marquis read those words, he winced. An exquisite pang stung his civilized vanity. He had invited the snub by sponsoring a savage. Was it possible that Artino had persuaded him to write that letter for the sole purpose of making him ridiculous? The Marquis went white at the thought. He suspected diabolical schemes everywhere, and he realized that his patronage of the poet was compromising him in the eyes of the world, and that he was paying for his immortality with his dignity. His murderous instincts awoke. Then his eyes fell on the conclusion of Ghiberti's letter. In his own, he had alluded very tactfully and even sympathetically to the attempt on Artino's life in Rome. The wording was consummate. While I believed that what you did against him was not done without good cause, yet I always hoped that your kindness and humanity would lead you to do what you have now done. But even the refined vagueness of that reference seemed to blunder in the light of Ghiberti's reply. There is a phrase in your letter which I cannot let pass, the bishop wrote, without begging you to rest assured that whatever was done against him was done without my command, my consent, or my knowledge. On the contrary, I was so shocked that had I not been dissuaded by infinite requests, I would have made a much greater demonstration than I did. The Marquis hastened to apologize for seeming to misjudge him, but on second thought he decided that he had not misjudged him after all. Ghiberti had merely learned, like himself, that if the man could not be murdered, there was no alternative but to humor him, and consoled by that thought, he forgave the bishop his snub. With the poet, however, the Marquis became extremely guarded. He no longer alluded to his family epic, he no longer alluded to anything. At 30, Federico Gonzaga was worn out with dissipation and almost a valetudinary, and like an invalid, he began to care more for his comfort than his glory. He resigned himself to oblivion and found that, after all, he was perfectly comfortable. The poet, finding his patron unwilling or unable to promote his reconciliation with Rome, also lost interest in Marfisa and began to cast about him for other protectors. In Venice he lacked influence, but he whistled and set to work. One thing he had learned, that to arrive anywhere it was necessary to begin, not at the bottom, but at the top. He began with the Doge. The Doge was pious, and to win his eye, the chameleon creature once more changed color. He had always advertised his contempt for the clergy, and it was repugnant to play the hypocrite, at least in public, but there was one priest in Venice whom he sincerely respected and who stood high in the favor of the Doge. Pietro Vergerio was one of a little band of Catholic reformers who hoped to stem the Lutheran menace by a judicious reform of the clergy. With these aims, Artino found it possible to sympathize, and he cultivated the reformer in private. But Artino could conceal nothing, and Titian blinked at the change which came over his crony. Was this the man he had painted? Something was amiss. It was not his veracity, it was not his virtuosity, but his voluptuousness. He seemed to be ashamed of it. He had lost or mislaid his good cheer. Artino blamed everything on his debts. He could not obtain credit. He expected to die on a bridge. Titian cocked his eye and surveyed the soul of matter. Why was he starving himself? What did he expect to gain? The flesh and the soul were indissoluble. He deceived no one but himself by such austerity. Artino shut his eyes and sighed. Even Titian misunderstood him, but he persevered. Pietro Vergerio was soon satisfied with his progress and recommended him to the Doge, and the Doge consented to intercede for him with the Pope on condition that Artino delete all abuse of His Holiness from his writings, and that he confess, communicate, and mend his life. The poet solemnly took the pledge.
Oh no.
In January 1530, the formal reconciliation of the Emperor and the Pope was solemnly celebrated in Bologna. It was an historic occasion. The dove of peace hovered, a bedraggled bird, over the peninsula. In the Duomo of Bologna, which had witnessed so many such scenes, Clement VII placed the iron crown on the head of Charles V. The Emperor knelt, rose, and restored the Pope to his temporal dominions, and as the pontiff went through the feeble motions of a nominal sovereignty, Italy lapsed into a servitude which was to last from the Renaissance to the Risorgimento. It was a peace of exhaustion, and it was fittingly celebrated. The Pope was worn out by ill health, humiliation, and the terrible experience of the sack. Nothing remained but his magnanimity, and when, amid the general dispensation of honors and indulgences, a petition in behalf of Pietro Artino was presented to him in the name of the Doge, he relented. He had lost his long memory in the sack. He forgot everything connected with it, but there was only one way to forget Artino. Accordingly, the pontifical victim of the Pax Romana bestowed on the penitent poet of the Pax Vobis his benediction and order of knighthood, the coveted brief for the Marfisa, and a promise of more substantial gifts to follow. And the emperor followed suit with an imperial knighthood and the privilegio. Little pride as he had left, Clement still prided himself on not misplacing his bounties, and he was deeply relieved, therefore, by the letter in which Artino acknowledged value received. Your majordomo, the Bishop of Bassone, he wrote, handed me the brief here in the palace of the Queen of Cyprus, and repeated what he was commanded to say, that is, that you were not so amazed at rising to the papacy from the rank of a mere knight of Rhodes, or at being imprisoned when you were pope, as you were by my flaying your good name, particularly as I knew why you did not punish a certain person for attempting my life. Holy Father, in everything that I have ever written or done, my tongue has always been true to my heart, and in attacking your honor, I have always protested that I was not to blame for taunting you. If those who have attained the summits of power and honor through you insulted you with spears, what wonder that I taunted you with tittle-tattle? Two things I repent, and I am ashamed of. I repent having censured a pope whose glory was always dearer to me than life, and I am ashamed that in censuring him I did so in the depths of his afflictions. Now I thank God that he has relieved your soul of the bitterness of offense and mine of the sweetness of revenge, and in future I shall be a good servant as I was in the days when my virtue, fostered by your praise, fought for you against Rome when Leo vacated the see. And I will so conduct myself that the Serenissimo Gritti, whose perfect modesty has mediated between your patience and my rage, will have occasion to reward rather than to punish me. Artino was as good as his word. In Lent, the Mantuan ambassador met him in church with tears in his eyes and his confession in hand. In the dim light, the poet had difficulty in reading it, but he studied it devoutly, and when he raised his eyes, they were harrowing, and when he spoke, his voice was husky. The ambassador was so amazed at the change that he immediately reported it to the Marquis. It was the event of the day in Venice. He told me that he knew God would not forsake him, that he would do him more good than he deserved, having been a great sinner, and that he had put an end to the life he was leading, being absolutely resolved to renounce his rancors and hatreds for the rest of his wicked ways, and that he was thoroughly contrite, and that he would confess and communicate with his whole household, which he had not done for many years. On learning of this reform, the Marquis also was relieved. He looked forward now to a little peace himself, and did not begrudge the poet his divine patron. No more was said on either side about the Marfisa. It remained in poem. Artino was too busy living the poem of the pure in heart to remember his epic. It had served its purpose. It had brought him a contrite heart and a sincere conviction of the vanity of human glory, including his own. And his one concern now was to redeem his soul. It was still in pawn. He did not haggle with heaven. He spent Lent communicating, confessing, dieting, mumbling, and mortifying himself. And when he appeared once more in public, the Doge congratulated himself on having won a soul and rendered a public service to the city. On a memorable afternoon in April 1530, in the hall of the Grand Council in the Ducal Palace, Artino publicly presented his soul to the Doge and the assembled Senate and acknowledged his debt to the city which had redeemed him. The gorgeous hall, fretted with gold, transfigured with frescoes, filled with ambrosial sun and the flickering shimmer of the lagoon, resounded to a grandiose harangue, which the poet pronounced with the sonorous serenity that the grandiose avowal of a man reading his naturalization papers in paradise. I, who in the liberty of this great state have learned at last to be free, repudiate courts forever, and here build the everlasting tabernacle of my advancing years. For here there is no place for betrayal. Here the cruelty of harlots cannot rule, nor the insolence of Ganymedes. Here favor cannot prevail over right. Here there is neither theft, nor violence, nor murder, and therefore, he concluded his inaugural apostrophe, I, who have terrified the wicked and protected the good, give myself to you, who are the fathers of your people, the brothers of your servants, the children of truth and friends of virtue, the comrades of strangers, the pillars of religion, the custodians of faith, the ministers of justice, the heirs of charity, and the subjects of clemency. Then, with a sweeping and synonymous movement of fluent obeisance, he turned to the Doge. Illustrious Prince, gather my love in the lap of your compassion, that I may praise the nurse of all other cities, and the mother elected of God to glorify the world, to moderate manners, and to give humanity to men, and to humble the proud, pardoning the erring. Such, he declared with a gesture which filled the room with a vast rhetorical fresco, such is its privilege to usher in peace and to end wars. Then his vision broadened, and his pacific inspiration raised the roof. Therefore the angels lead their dances and assemble their choirs and spin their wheels of light over the field of air above it, extending the ordinances of its laws and the length of its life beyond the terms prescribed by nature. O universal fatherland, O common liberty, O station of the scattered, how much greater were the woes of Italy were your goodness less. Here is the refuge of her peoples, the security of her riches, the safeguard of her honor. She embraces her when others abuse her. She supports her when others abase her. She welcomes her when others expel her, and feeds her when others starve her. And cheering her in her tribulations, sustains her in love and charity. And associating himself with the celestial city and identifying himself with its destiny, he stood inhaling its sovereign independence and exhaling his own triumphant emancipation. Be mute, O Rome, for here there are none who could or would tyrannize over our liberty. That's enough for today.
All right. Very good. You're into it.
This is the best one so far. What a shit. What a lovely shit.
He ran a real scam. He was good with words. He came to the realization that words are going to save him.
Put a marker right in this page. We'll start here next time.
Oh, boy. The guy was surviving that bit, huh?
Wow. It's great.